And welcome, namaste, everybody. And I'm glad to see so many turn out today. Given that I'm into energy and interconnectedness, we're going to start my session by turning to the person next to you and saying hello, introducing ourselves, because we are all energetically connected. Even if we don't like who we're sitting next to, let's do it. Okay, good. You don't have to tell the whole life story. Just hi is good. Okay, so if you don't hear me, I'm just putting this a bit lower, but if you can't hear me well, please let me know, okay? So, right. I'm going to talk today a lot about epigenetics because I believe it was the concepts behind epigenetics that saved me from my cancer. When I did have cancer, certainly the nutrition and all the other aspects that the previous speaker mentioned, they were relevant, including homeopathy, naturopathy, nutrition. I looked at all of that. But what was most significant for me was the thoughts and the emotions that I'd been harbouring for decades as a result of childhood experiences. So I'm going to talk a lot more about that because the work of Dr. Bruce Lipton, Dr. Bruce Lipton was a pioneer in the field of epigenetics, so I have got a lot to say about that. So, and as you can see, I was supposed to be buried in 2002, and as you can see, that hasn't happened. And I think it's quite a long way off. So, we know we're going to bring some joy and optimism. I'm actually living a life now that I never thought I would live. And if I had have believed the prognosis, then I wouldn't be standing in front of you today because I would have been subject to chemo and radium, which I believed in my heart that I didn't need. And as it eventuated, I didn't. Here I am. So, this is something I'd like you to remember today. We can't solve problems using the same kind of thinking we used when we created them. And I know that you're all here today because you understand the need to think differently and to approach your health and well-being differently. So, Einstein is one of my favourites. So we've said our hellos, we know who we are. So we're very fortunate to be living in an era where health and well-being and the way we treat health and well-being is revolutionised. And part of the reason for that, and fundamental to that actually, are the new sciences, the quantum physics, the epigenetics, the neuroscience. All of that has opened a gateway that was not previously open. So the potential that we have now to treat ourselves is unlike anything we've known before. And so I'm going to be talking about the new sciences, the role of emotion and core belief, cellular memory, which some of us think that, yes, if I go to the gym and I do 50 push-ups, that, next time it'll be easier because my memory has that. My cells have that memory. The reality is that everything that happens to us in our lives from when we were born, and even previous to that, actually prenatally, resides in our cellular memory. So we're going to see how that affects us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Then we're going to look at the how and why of change. Most of the clients I see in my practice, and have been doing this for many, many years, don't believe they can change. There's a fear that they can't change. They think that, Diana, I can't change. I've had this for 20 or 30 years, these beliefs and this depression, etc., this anxiety, and I really don't think that you can do much about it. But, my friend comes to you, so I thought I'd give it a shot. The reality is that when you have an experience that creates trauma in your body and your mind and your spirit, it takes about a nanosecond for that to take effect. A nanosecond. You think back to when perhaps you've witnessed an accident or something unpleasant or even been in an argument with someone. The effects of that take a nanosecond to register. But they'll be with you the rest of your life. Equally, when you're young and you had a wonderful experience and Dad just bought you your first new pony or your first new bike, that memory stays with you for the rest of your life. And it's because there's a strong emotional attachment to the experience. And when there's emotional attachment, then the cellular memory absorbs that into your subconscious, and that actually is what dictates your behaviours and your approach to life in general. The next thing we're going to look at is integrative reprogramming, which is the modality I've introduced and have been working with for many years now. And believe it or not, it can pop out thoughts, beliefs, emotions, patterns and behaviours instantaneously from your body. There are a number of people sitting here in this room that have had that experience with me, and I'm pleased to say they're alive and well, and they're sitting here, which is a good thing. So, next. When I was diagnosed with cancer, as I said before, I was told that without the chemo and the radium, I would be buried in 2002. But I chose not to have chemo and radium, although I did proceed with the surgery. And at the time I was diagnosed, and even now I suppose, they put quite a sense of urgency. They instill a sense of urgency into us about having cancer surgery and whatever else needs to be done. And so maybe if I knew then what I know now, I may not have even had the surgery. Because now I understand that the less interference that we have in the body, the less interference we allow in the body, the healthier the body and the quicker the body can heal, and the healthier and stronger it is. When I say interference, I don't mean nutritional, I mean drugs and surgery. A lot of the surgeries that we see now are unnecessary, and I think if you do your research, you'll find that that is the case in many illnesses and disorders. It's not always necessary. So what I came to learn with my cancer is that my emotional history and the beliefs that subsequently stemmed from that emotional history were what was keeping me stuck, and which fed the cancer as far as I was concerned. So I went searching for the true cause. I've spent 7 months in Nepal in meditation and developing my spirituality. Not that I wasn't spiritual before, I like to think that I was, but I think I'd become a little materialistic. I was in the corporate world. I'd had 30 years and the last probably 15, 20 of those years managing businesses. And so my identity was built around my corporate life. And of course, once you have cancer, you realise, firstly, that you don't want to continue working 10 and 12 hours a day for 5 or 6 days a week. Then you learn that the money doesn't matter. And so things changed for me. So I went from being a type A workaholic to all of a sudden I'm working 4 days a week, and who cares, and it's only money. So which was quite a dramatic shift from where I used to be. So being in Nepal for 7 months was really the most transitional process, even beyond the cancer, as far as I was concerned. Because to be able to see people that were happy, that had nothing, some of them didn't even know if they were going to eat that day or that night, to be able to live in that for 7 months, close up and personal, that's a very different experience. And I can only wish that more people would have that experience, because it would help us appreciate, what we do have and what happiness is all about. So, IRT program, we'll talk about that. And ultimately, after IRT, I decided to become a life coach for no other reason that I can reach more people as a life coach. Not everyone wants to say that they're coming to a therapist, but everyone wants to say at the moment, I've got a life coach. So remember, years ago it used to be, I've got my own shrink. So now it's actually, I've got a life coach. So that's why, as I said, I took that certification in order to have that happen, reach more people. So the story of my cancer, as far as I was concerned, were the things that happened to me when I was much younger, which I won't go into now, but there a lot of them were experiences that I would never have expected to have, and I would not wish on too many other people. So when you have cancer and you're speaking to your counsellors and your spiritual mentors, what they say to you is sit down and think about what has happened to you in the course of your life that has caused you anxiety or sadness or whatever it was, because these things are feeding the cancer, and these are the things that gave rise to the cancer. And initially when I was told that, I didn't believe it, because one of my mentors said, in fact, you've created this yourself. And so I was so angry when she said that, as if anyone's going to create cancer for themselves. But the reality was that the emotions and the beliefs that I was holding, I wasn't prepared to let go. And my identity had become about this sad, angry person, very successful professionally, by the way. So we're looking at almost two different personas here. Very successful professionally, but underneath all that were all these emotions and beliefs that were keeping me stuck. So I started looking at I wrote these down. I could have used any of the hundreds and hundreds of client profiles that I have in order to do this exercise, but I wanted you to relate to this on a very personal basis. And this is part of my story. I couldn't fit all the words on there, actually. I've got about 200 words that I could have put on this emotional inventory. But the cancer, as far as I was concerned, was fed by these emotions and the beliefs, as I say, that arose from them. We lived what was considered a relatively happy family life, middle class, both parents working. I came from an Italian heritage, which was, you work hard and you make a living and you survive and you're well. So everything appeared to be happy. But as you know, in many families, you can have the exact same parents and your siblings are having a very different experience of that family dynamic. My two other sisters were quite happy, and I was not, for whatever the reason, which I haven't got time to go into now. But I was not happy, and I became quite insular and moody and all sorts of things that I didn't want to be. But that escalated over time, and I also became, unknowing to me at the time, very angry towards my parents because I expected them to notice. I expected someone to notice that something was wrong, but nobody did. So I became more inward and more withdrawn. And there was a point at which, and I'm sure you won't believe this, I was actually shy and could hardly speak. I mean, I'd withdraw into myself, and it was because I was so sad. So when I sat down after having been diagnosed, I sat down and got over the anger and the shock of it. I started looking back on my life and the things that caused me most pain and who caused me most pain. Because parents most often, of course, believe that they're doing things in the way that they should and that is best for their children. But no one, as I say, in one family you've got 4 different children, they have 4 different experiences of what's happening in the family. So these are some of the emotions that I felt at the time, as I said, many, many others. But I realised that in the course of this process of healing, that unless I dealt with the emotions and the beliefs that were holding me stark, then I wouldn't progress and I wouldn't heal. And that came to me one day. Virtually, I woke up one morning and I thought, unless I deal with all these things that I've been suppressing for almost 50 years, then I wouldn't be progressing. So that's what I needed to do. What happens to us over time is that when we don't release the emotions held in cellular memory and the beliefs, and we don't change that, we end up having relatively unhappy lives from a very early age. I'm sure many of you, and I know some of you in the room are working with children, it's very, very important that we deal with the issues when children are young. And if we do address them when they're young, they will eventually lead happy, well-balanced lives. If we wait, or if we don't address, or if we ignore or go into denial about something, because most of us don't want to admit that family members have problems. They think he or she is just being a kid, or she's just a teenager. That's how things are. The reality is that we're not born to be sad. We're not born to be depressed. We're born to be happy, to be creative, to be joyful, to be spontaneous. That's what we're born to be. But our emotions and our belief systems overwhelm many of us at a very early age, and so life doesn't go along in a very healthy and happy way. The good thing about the new sciences is that they're teaching us that all of that can be reversed. So these are some of the feelings. I'd like you all now just to take a moment, please, and to look at that list and see whether any of those emotions and concepts resonate with you. Some may or may not resonate more than others. But the reality is that whatever you can relate to on that slide will be determining the way you interact with others and how you interact with the outside world. And it's often not good. And frankly, if it were good, you probably wouldn't be sitting here, would you? Would you? No, good. Okay, so what we find through early childhood development is that most of us are hardwired, that's with personality and emotion, in these early years of our life. So between 0 and 4, we are 50% hardwired, emotionally, psychologically. And that influence obviously is from our first exposure to our carers. And for some of that's a really good experience. For some of us, that's a very good experience, and for others, it's perhaps not quite so. Most of us in the room wouldn't remember what happened between 0 and 4 years old. Some people do. I've had clients come in and say, this happened to me when I was 3, and this happened to me when I was 4, but most people don't remember. So by the time they come to me, their view and their perception of who they are and what's happening is clouded, and it's dimmed to the point that they're quite confused about why they're in the situation they're in. So between 4 and 8, it's 30%, which again is quite significant. And they're the years that we start interacting with the outside world. We start perhaps going to kindergarten and having play dates and meeting other children. In that period, we start realising that our family is different to Billy's family. Because I went over there last night and they're all happy and there's no screaming and yelling. And they all sit at the table and have dinner together. And the brothers and sisters, they love each other and they help each other. Isn't that interesting that our family doesn't function in that way? So that realisation starts coming about. Then between 8 and 18, 15%, again, we go to school. We start looking at what we're doing going forward in terms of employment. We interact. We have our teenage, our first love happens usually in that period. And as we know, junior school and middle school and high school are not what they used to be years ago. These days there is so much stress and tension and anxiety associated with children going to school. Bullying is a thing that may have existed in my time, but it was rarely ever surfaced. And we actually went to school in a multicultural school. And there are things that young children are experiencing these days that we had no knowledge of virtually. And drugs. So they have all these pressures, all these experiences that they have to cope with now that we never had to in my day, going to school. So adulthood, we say that 5% we're conditioned in adulthood. That's true and not true. It's true because the research was accurate at the time, and what makes it untrue at this point is that Dr. Bruce Lipton and epigenetics has shown us that everything is reversible. Almost everything is reversible. And he quotes that a lot of the chronic diseases that we have are only 5% congenital disease, inherited from your parents. The rest of them have been created by environmental factors. And environmental factors means your emotions, your thoughts, who you're living with. Are you happy in your family dynamic? Are you happy in your job? Maybe you're not. I came from 30 years in recruitment before I started doing this work. After the cancer, I decided to have a significant change of direction. And I can tell you many people are in jobs because of what it earns them. It's about the dollars. It's about lifestyle. It's about having the latest vehicle, all the latest toys, whatever it is, and keeping up with what we used to say in Australia, keeping up with the Joneses, which I've noticed everyone is still doing over here. So some things are quite common, aren't they? So, as I say, we're happy to have that. The other way that we absorb information and shock and cellular trauma is through instantaneous events. So has anyone heard of Dr. Gerd Hammer in German New Medicine? So there are a few. The story of Dr. Hammer is that when he was in his, I think it was his 40s, late 40s or early 50s, his son was accidentally shot. And within 3 months of that episode, Dr. Hammer, who'd been healthy all his... shot and died, I should say. He was killed. So within 3 months of that episode, Dr. Hammer discovered that he had testicular cancer. And he'd never been unhealthy for a day in his life. And he started thinking about how and why those two events were connected. His wife also died shortly before he was diagnosed as well. So he started trying to look at what are the connecting factors, what's happening within me that this happened. And frankly, you know, those two major events in his life he understood very quickly were contributing factors. But then he looked at over 31,000 patients and he asked for their cooperation in trying to make a link between their thoughts, their emotions and their physicality, what was happening. And he was very successful in doing so. In fact, he was so successful that he was ostracised from the German scientific and medical fraternity and from his university. He's had about 8 to 10 threatening situations on his life. He's been threatened that many times. He's been incarcerated because what he was doing in introducing these concepts was that he was destabilising and undermining the medical tradition and the medical fraternity. And they didn't like that. So he, in fact, is living, I think, in Sweden or Norway at the moment, if anyone knows. That's my understanding, where he is considered to be much safer. And there are practitioners and medical doctors throughout the world who have adopted his ideas that you must look at the holistic person. Looking at something from a secular perspective or a single perspective doesn't hold any water in the long term. It's actually not solving the problem. So he took that view. And the other thing that people are a little bit disturbed about, that he says that when a conflict shock is resolved, then the body can restore itself to natural health. And he feels very strongly that the interference of the medical fraternity, being both surgically and otherwise, have not contributed to people's well-being. In fact, it's done the reverse. Because what Dr. Harmer says is that if you allow the body to heal naturally, then it will survive and it will thrive. It goes through processes and cycles of disruption and then healing, and that healing takes time. But what we do now is we're accustomed to rushing in and having a surgery. And I admit that, as I said, I had the surgery for the cancer, but if I knew then what I know now, I may not have even had the surgery. And I also know that had I accepted the offer of chemo and radium, that I wouldn't be standing here before you today. I know that for a fact. If your immune system is so weakened that you can entertain cancer in your body and have done for some time, how does it make sense to add toxin to that? It made no sense to me. And so I chose not to do it. And at that time, it was causing stress in my family because my family thought, and this is called emotional blackmail, especially from an Italian perspective, if there are any Italians or Europeans in the room, don't you love us? Do you not want to see your nieces and nephews grow up? Do you not want to be the brother and sister that we want you to be? Has nothing to do with it. What had to do with it is I started listening to my body, and which told me intuitively, don't go anywhere near the radium and the chemo. And I'm not suggesting that anyone in this room choose that option, but for me, I knew it was the right option, and I know to this day that it's the right option. So I've made the choice. There we are. So what we really need to make a change in our lives is an open mind. The fact that you're sitting here today tells me that you have that open mind. Otherwise, you wouldn't be looking at new solutions and new challenges. Information and tools, which we are all providing, myself and all the other speakers are providing today, and I will run you through the integrative reprogramming. The intention and the motivation. And as we know, intention and motivation are two different things. You can intend to go to New York, it's on your bucket list, and then all of a sudden your favourite group is playing in New York and your girlfriend wants to go, so suddenly we're motivated to go. So the motivation is very, very important in helping people change. And if people come to me because their mum or their wife or their sister has sent them to me, the first question I ask is, are you wanting to be here yourself, or are you coming because your wife sent you? I had one man say to me, well, frankly, my wife said, if I don't get sorted and don't come and see you, we're not speaking. And I think that was one of the lesser consequences, and I think there were going to be more severe consequences. But the reality, as I said to him, is unless he's committed to change and he wants to be going through the process, then there's no point, right? You're undermining, self-sabotaging. And the action, we'll talk to you more about action as we go through. So epigenetics and cellular memory, which Dr. Chris mentioned before, Bruce Lipton wrote a book called The Biology of Belief some years ago. Are you hearing me well? Okay. Sorry?
It's a little muffled.
Is it muffled? Am I too close or too far?
I wonder. I don't know. Maybe more directly.
Closer?
Yeah, perhaps. Yeah.
Okay.
Please.
All right. So, Bruce Lipton wrote the book The Biology of Belief, and when he first came up with the concept that the DNA was not our Bible, he likewise was ostracised from his university post, from the medical fraternity, from the scientific fraternity, and then ended up in a third world country because they said that he had virtually lost his marbles. And they said, you're not making any sense. And so it was interesting, though, that simultaneously, across the globe, other people were doing similar research. And they were finding the same thing, that the DNA is, in fact, the structural blueprint of the body. But the functions of the body were determined by the epigenetic energy, which was the energy surrounding the cell. And that is an energy that can be passed on intergenerationally. You can see there that I've mentioned this, The Ghost in Your Genes, which is a wonderful documentary by the BBC. Has anyone seen that documentary? I know people that have come to my classes certainly have seen it. It was one of the first. It was the first scientific proof that intergenerational energy was being transferred. So, and it's a very interesting documentary. If you don't have time to watch the full hour of it, sections, I think it's part 1, 2 and 5, are the key elements of that presentation. But the scientists, the two scientists that worked in collaboration to define this, interviewed on that, and they tell the story of how 3 or 4 generations ago, when a great-great-great-grandmother went through something like a drought or even a fire, the emotional residual impact of that was transferred energetically from one generation to another, which sounds almost impossible. But if you watch that documentary, you'd be amazed. And as I said, it was the first real scientific proof that this energy was passed intergenerationally. So what you do today, what you say, what you think, how you behave, will affect your children and your great-grandchildren, believe it or not. So it's worth a look. Psychoneuroimmunology, Dr. Gabor Mate, we've heard of him, he's a local. Has anyone read this book? Worth a read, not many. Okay, again, he's a local doctor who has a holistic approach to healing, and he does work and has been doing work on the east side. And when he's treating addicted people, he's looking, interestingly enough, not originally, but later in life, he started realising that it was about their story. It's really about your story. And that, when I went back to the slide, I won't go back, but the slide that showed you the cancer and all the emotions attached, I could have substituted cancer for all the other ailments and complaints that people come in to see me with. The emotional makeup is still the same, and Dr. Mate says exactly the same thing. One addict is obviously addicted and has those same symptoms, but his story is quite different to anyone else's. Yet the emotions, the emotional inventory, is common to both. So we need to be looking at that aspect of how we heal. That's a very good read. Heart Math Institute. The Heart Math Institute is an institute, I think for 19 years they've been researching the connection between your heart, your brain, your emotions, and your quality of life. And they've done some very, very interesting research. Most of these links are on my website. I don't distribute my presentations, but if you go to my website, I have a resource page, and that will give you all of this information. Mm-hmm. Neuroplasticity, we talked about that a few minutes ago, and Dr. Chris also mentioned that. The neuroplasticity, some years ago, was thought to be quite limited in adults. I don't know if any of you in this room remember, but 20 or 30 years ago, some bright spark in government or someplace thought that because babies have far more neuronal connections and synaptic connections when they're between 0 and 4, that would be the time to teach them 4 languages at once and not to play. Okay, does anyone in the room remember that time? There are a few people. It's interesting because what they were doing is they were cramming these children with information, 4 languages at a time. They were teaching them geography, history, music, art. And interestingly, in retrospect, 20 years, 30 years later, they've found that those children were the most maladjusted children pretty much on the planet. And it was because they weren't allowed to be children. They were put into structured environments where they had no free time. They were not allowed to engage in play as most children are allowed to be. The equivalent, right, by the way, right now is all the technology, of course. At 3 or 4 years old, they're starting to program and reprogram. So that's, very cool on one level, but at the same time, we're looking at a different generation. So the neuroplasticity has proven the concept of that is that as we age, we are still capable of learning and changing, provided we present ourselves with new challenges. If we do the same old thing with the same old thinking, are you going to learn and grow and grow new synaptic connections? No, that's not going to happen. So we need to be forever learning and changing how we live our life. Quantum physics, the observer effect. The observer effect is such that what quantum physics has proven is that a photon, which is the smallest the smallest form of life, can be changed from a wave function to a particle function and vice versa merely by observing it. I'm sure you would have all heard the concept that your experience of life is dependent upon your perception. It's like the glass is half full or the glass is half empty. And so what the observer effect has proven, again scientifically, is that if you change the way you're thinking about any one thing, and you're willing to do it, you're motivated to do it, and it is possible for you, then your life and your surrounding energy and experience will be different. So these things I learned, and they're the basis of how I developed integrative reprogramming. Bruce Lipton found, we'll just go back to Bruce Lipton's, genes are blueprints. The DNA doesn't control your biology. The signals outside of the cell, i.e. the environment, serve as the control mechanism. Positive or negative thoughts also have a profound effect on the behaviour of genes, but only when they're in harmony with subconscious programming. And that's why when many people come to me and say, I've done 3,000 affirmations about XYZ and nothing's changed, so what's wrong? I say, well, an affirmation is done in the conscious brain, which is only 12%, maybe 15% of your brain function. The balance of your brain function is subconscious. How you think and how you feel, it's like a well of history. That's your subconscious memory, and that's your cellular memory. So unless you address things at a subconscious and a cellular memory level, they don't change. You can say another 3,000 affirmations, and that isn't going to change a lot. Bruce Lipton, this is probably just a quote, that he was exhilarated, etc. The key issue is here, I could change the character of my life by changing my beliefs. Pardon. When he ultimately was welcomed back into the scientific and medical fraternity, he was hailed as a guru because all of a sudden everyone was realising that what he said was right. And it's the same sort of change as when we all discovered that the earth was round and not flat. This is how instrumental and how significant his discoveries are and his work is. So the other thing that he says towards the end of that book is that an ultimate realisation was that the healer, being yourself or myself or anyone else, needs to address body, mind and spirit. So it needs to be a cohesive, holistic approach to your healing. And that's the only way that healing can happen. All right? So, positive emotions. Heart Math Institute, basically they're saying that there's increased harmony in heart rhythms, provided that there is less stress in the body. I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but essentially negative emotions and positive emotions affect your physicality in a way that it wasn't understood before. Heart Math findings, changes that occur when techniques are applied that increase coherence in rhythmic patterns of heart rate variability. That's the dramatic positive change. Okay. The focus of IRT, which is the modality that I'm working with, is to calm down the heart rate and bring clarity to the mind. It's a form, in a sense, of meditation, because meditation has the same effect. I'm hoping there are some meditators in the room. Are there any meditators in the room? Very good. The numbers are slowly growing. But I went back to my meditation when I had cancer, and I learned about meditation before. But, life gets in the way. I'm busy making money and having a life. And then when I had cancer, of course, we pray to God, don't we? And we ask for some sort of help, and all of a sudden, all these things that we should be doing, we remember are important, and we go back. to restructuring. So the new sciences, in summation, we're all connected energetically. And Dr. John Wheeler, who was a physicist at Princeton, defined that as a participatory universe. We're all participating in each other's lives, whether we like it or not. We're all connected, whether we like it or not. What we do and what we think affects everyone around us. Our emotions and our beliefs and attitudes are directly linked to our ill health. We all possess an innate capacity to facilitate change. All of us can. I've had clients in from 4 years old to about, I think the oldest one's been about 87. The 4-year-old, interestingly enough, was much more receptive than the 87-year-old because he thought it was like magic and he thought it was a bit of fun. And so all of a sudden, this child that was brought to me as being dysfunctional and had been to psychologists, psychiatrists and all sorts of things, we worked out what the problem was, and it was simply that he was sad. He was feeling isolated. And he had 2 sisters. I think one was 9 and one 10. And his father was he was with an international IT company. So he was away 2 weeks out of the 4 of the month. His mother was a teacher. And by the time she got home, she wasn't particularly interested in children. She was tired. They had a nanny. And this little 4-year-old was left to his own devices at 4. And when his sisters had friends over to play and a play date, he wasn't invited because he was a boy. And they didn't want anyone but girls in their room. So here's this little 4-year-old wandering around lost. And so it took 2 or 3 hours maximum, that was very maximum, to reverse that condition. And I had an email from his mother about a month later, and she said, "What happened to the little boy that I brought to you? Because we have someone quite different." I had a severe talking to, by the way, to the mother. And in case you haven't gathered, I'm fairly direct. So I had a chat to the mother, and I also chatted to the sisters who decided that, he shouldn't be included because he's just a boy. So thankfully that has changed. But that's how simple it is if we discover what's really happening. What are we really feeling? What are we really thinking? The other thing that came out of the new sciences is that we are no longer victims of life. We are actually the co-creators. You decide. You decide. And as I say to everyone that walks into my office, change is possible. It's a choice that you make. Change is possible. So, integrative reprogramming. How am I going for time? Good? Where's Laurel?
You're good.
I'm good, thank you. Okay, so integrative programming. What I did after studying the work of Bruce Lipton and many others actually who work in this field now is that if we had some help defining our story and the incidents in our life that were defining the way we interpret life and communicate with the world, if we had some help doing that, we are then able to change direction. I've had people that have been born to poverty, that have had 3 or 4 generations of poverty, that their whole forward direction has been changed by changing their beliefs and their emotions. That's all it took. They were depressed, admittedly, but they didn't take drugs, actually, and they didn't take any supplements. What we did is we just got them to think differently. And we can do that, as I say, instantaneously. It's a process that works very effectively for children because, as I say, they think it's magic. And adults are usually the most challenging because, of course, they're set in their ways. Not that everyone in this room is set in their ways, but many people are quite set. And they don't have a belief that things can change, but they can. And the change is instantaneous. I'm not going to ask anyone who's been a client, and there are a number of them in this room, to raise their hands, but I can tell you that all of them have had an experience where within the first session and at the very latest, the second session, have felt change at a profound level. And if you feel that change emotionally and that you feel lighter in your mind and your body, then you can make better decisions about your other health choices. Do I go to a naturopath? Do I go to a homeopath? Do I continue? Do I go to a chiropractor? Perhaps I need some adjustment. What supplements do I need? Who should I see as a nutritionist or a naturopath? All of those things come easy to you once you are free of the blockages created by fear, emotion, and beliefs. We live life differently once that's happened. The difference between IRT and other modalities is that it's not hypnotherapy. You don't have to go into regression or use any device at all. You need to sit down and tell me the story. Once I know what your story is, I see your story as a jigsaw puzzle. And I'm able to identify the patterns, the beliefs and the emotions very, very readily that are keeping you stuck in the reality that you're in. Change occurs simultaneously, mind, body and spirit. The time span to wellness is way shorter than going to a traditional counsellor. When I was initially trying to deal with all the trauma that happened to me as a child, I went to a psychologist and a psychotherapist. I spent on and off 8 years at the psychologist, and he made a huge amount of money. I wasn't feeling emotionally better. I understood intellectually my role as the victim and the role of the perpetrator or perpetrators. I understood that. Intellectually, I understood it. Emotionally, I didn't feel much better. When I started working with this type of modality and dealing with the emotions and the belief systems, within a matter of days, 30 or 40 years of sadness, of depression, of history were alleviated within a matter of days. And I'm not exaggerating. So those things happen very quickly when you're doing it on a multidimensional level. Responsiveness from your client and from my clients and their engagement is far greater. It's far greater because we have results pretty much immediately. And so they're interested in coming back. In all those years I was going to the psychologist, I have to say that it became quite tedious. How are you this week? Well, I'm not much different than I was last week. Thank you, it was an interesting conversation. And it was more money. And this went on year after year after year. And then I started working with this sort of thing, and I thought, heavens, I'm not going to say that they don't serve a purpose and have value. They do, because without that, I wouldn't be where I am today. So I needed that as an entree to where I was going, and I accept that. So we should never think that anything we do from a healing perspective is wasted, because it never is. It's contributing on some level and in some way to our well-being. So the change that happens in IRT is profound, and it is lasting change. I've had addicts, all sorts of... I had a woman with bulimia who was 46 years old. She'd had bulimia for 25 years, and in 5 sessions the bulimia had been lifted from her body. It wasn't anything about the bulimia, it was about her relationship with her mum and her dad and how she felt about herself. Right? So, next. In case you're still convinced that it doesn't work, this is a testimonial from from Dr. Boutet, Mark Boutet. Anyone, I think a few people in the room probably know Dr. Mark. So Dr. Mark has gone through my training sessions, and he uses this modality in his healing every day, and he's seen hundreds and hundreds of people since he was trained in this modality. He uses it a lot more for the physical, whereas even though I use it for the physical corrections, I mostly focus on the emotional and the spiritual and the belief systems, because they are, in my way of thinking, they are what undermines everything else. So if you can clear your emotions and realign your thoughts, then you have a greater chance of making better decisions about your health and the direction you're going in. So, if we're still not convinced that it works, here are some testimonials from patients. I have hundreds of them, by the way. These are just a few that may be of interest. Okay, so that's how we should be living life. Happily, productively, creatively. As I say, health and your well-being going forward is a matter of choice. It's not a matter of chance. Choice, not chance, determines our destiny, Aristotle.